The storm came down from the north the way grief comes to a quiet house. Without knocking, without mercy, and far too fast to outrun, Geneva pulled the hood of her brown cloak lower over her brow and bent her shoulders against the wind. The forest path she knew so well had vanished under fresh snow, and the bundle of dried herbs strapped to her back grew heavier with every step. She had stayed in the woods too long. She always did. The fever moss only grew under the old birches, and the old widow at the edge of the village would not see the next morning without it. So Geneva had knelt in the freezing dark and dug through the frost with her bare fingers, until her hands no longer felt like hands at all. Now the light was gone, the cold had teeth, and the cottage was still a half-mile away. She did not complain. There was no one to complain to. There had been no one for a very long time. Her mother had been the healer before her, and her mother's mother before that, and each of them had lived in that same small cottage at the lonely edge of the village, where the houses thinned and the forest began. The villagers came when their children burned with fever, or their old ones could not breathe, and they paid in eggs and firewood and grudging thanks. And then they hurried home before anyone saw them lingering at the witch woman's door. That was the shape of Geneva's life, needed in the dark, forgotten in the daylight. She had learned not to mind, or she had learned to say she did not mind, which was nearly the same thing if you said it long enough. The wind dropped for a single breath, the way it sometimes does in the worst of a storm, as though the whole world were pausing to listen. And in that small silence Geneva heard it, a howl. Not the long, proud cry of a hunting wolf, not the chorus of a pack on the move. This was broken, low, and wet, the sound of a living thing that had stopped believing it would be answered. It came from the direction of the frozen stream, off the path, deeper into the dark. Every sensible thought she owned told her to keep walking. The villagers feared the wolves of the northern woods, more than they feared the cold, more than they feared hunger, more than they feared God. Rogue wolves especially, the masterless ones cast out from the great packs, were said to be half mad with their own loneliness, and a woman alone in a storm was exactly the kind of soft, slow thing that desperate creatures killed. She had heard the warnings her whole life. She had nodded along. She turned off the path and walked toward the howl. She would tell herself later that she did not decide to do it, that her feet simply chose for her. But that was not true, and she knew it was not true. She decided. She had always been the kind of person who decided, in the end, to go where the pain was. It was the only thing about herself she had never once been ashamed of. The snow grew deeper near the stream, and twice she stumbled and caught herself on the bare branches. Then the trees opened, and she stopped. In the blue-black hollow beside the frozen water lay a wolf. It was enormous, larger than any animal Geneva had ever seen, its fur a white so pure it seemed to hold its own faint light against the dark. It lay on its side in the churned and bloodied snow, and its ribs heaved with each shallow breath. A long wound ran down its flank, crusted black at the edges and weeping red at the center, the kind of wound left by a blade rather than a claw, and its belly. Geneva's breath caught. Its belly was huge and round and tight. The wolf was carrying pups. The wolf was close, terribly close to giving birth. It lifted its head when it caught her scent, and its eyes opened, and Geneva forgot to be afraid. They were not the flat yellow eyes of a beast. They were gold, deep and clear and aware, and they were full of something Geneva recognized in the way you recognize your own Rhee's neck. Half buried in the blood-stained fur hung a chain, not a collar, a chain of pale linked metal snapped clean in the middle, and from it hung a flat pendant carved with a crest Geneva did not know. A crescent moon above a crown. It was the kind of thing a queen might wear. It did not belong on a wolf dying in the snow. "All right," Geneva whispered, and her voice shook, though not from cold. "All right, I have you. I have you. The wolf should be dangerous. The wolf should be left where it lay. The wolf had been marked by chain or by curse or by the whispered lore of the village, as something that did not deserve to be saved. But Geneva saw the pain before she saw the danger. She had always seen the pain first. It was her gift, and it was her curse, and it was the only inheritance her mother had truly left her. She knelt in the red snow, and she put her freezing hands against the great white head, and the wolf impossibly did not bite. It only sighed, a long shudder running through its whole vast body, and let its head fall against her knees, as though it had been waiting in that hollow not to die, but to be found. "You can't stay here," Geneva said. "You'll freeze before the pups come, we both will." She had no sled, no rope, nothing but her own thin arms and her own stubborn heart, so she did the only thing she could do. She got behind the wolf, dug her boots into the snow, wrapped her arms beneath its forelegs, and pulled. The animal weighed more than she did, far more, and the first heave moved it nothing at all. She set her teeth and pulled again. A foot, another foot. The wolf, understanding at last, gathered what strength it had left and pushed with its hind legs, and together, a half-frozen healer and a dying wolf queen, they began to crawl out of the hollow toward the small, dark shape of the cottage that waited beyond the trees. Out knowing it, the tears freezing on her cheeks, she slammed the door against the storm. She sank to her knees beside the animal on her own floor, and the wolf began to change. Geneva had heard the old stories. Everyone in the north had, but hearing is not the same as seeing, and what she saw then, she would carry in her heart for the rest of her life. The white fur drew inward like frost, melting from glass. The long limbs shortened and softened. The great golden eyes remained, but they were set now in a human face, a woman's face, pale as the snow she had been lying in, framed by hair the color of moonlight on water. She was beautiful, she was royal. There was no other word for the way she held even her dying. And she was, still, enormously, painfully pregnant, her belly straining against the torn remains of a white and silver gown. Her lips moved. Geneva bent close to hear. "Do not call the village," the woman whispered, and her voice was the thread of a voice, barely there. "Please, they will kill the child before they ever learn his name." Geneva stared at the broken chain around the stranger's throat, at the crescent and the crown, and felt the whole quiet shape of her life crack down the middle like ice on a thawing river. This was not a simple rescue. This was the beginning of a royal scandal, and she had just carried it through her own front door. Greetings, dear viewers. Before the snow carries us deeper into Geneva's story, your support means more than words can say. If these tales of forbidden love, royal secrets, wounded hearts, and ancient pacts have found a place with you, please subscribe, leave a like, and tell us where in the world you are listening from, the time and the day. Every comment helps this channel travel farther than the forest roads our heroines must walk alone. Thank you so much. Now then, let us return to the night. Geneva opened her cottage door to a wolf the whole kingdom had been hunting. Geneva moved the way her mother had taught her, with her hands ahead of her thoughts. She did not let herself stand in the doorway of her own life and marvel at the impossible woman bleeding on her floor. There would be time for marveling later, if there was a later at all. For now, there was a wound that needed cleaning, and a body that needed warming, and a child that needed, more than anything, to be kept inside its mother a little while longer. She built up the fire until it roared. She set water to heat in her largest iron pot. She pulled clean linen from the chest at the foot of her narrow bed, the linen she saved for births and for deaths, the only fine cloth she owned, and she did not let herself think about which of the two she was preparing for now. The woman watched her through half-closed golden eyes. "You are not afraid of me," she said. It was not a question. "I'm terrified of you," Geneva answered, kneeling to peel the ruined gown away from the wound along the woman's side. But fear can wait its turn. Hold still. This will hurt. It did hurt. The woman made no sound, though Geneva felt her flinch beneath her hands as the warm cloth lifted away the frozen blood. The wound was deep and clean and deliberate, a sword stroke slanting down from below the ribs. Whoever had done it had meant to kill her. They had very nearly succeeded. "Who did this to you?" Geneva asked quietly. "Men I trusted." The woman's eyes drifted toward the fire. "Men who smiled at my table. That is the only kind of enemy worth fearing, healer. The wolf in the open you can fight. The wolf in the council chamber, the one who refills your cup and asks after your health. That one will open your throat and weep at your funeral, unless for queens." The gold eyes found Geneva's face. "What is your name?" "Geneva, Geneva." The woman seemed to taste it. "I am Marlene. I will tell you the rest of my name only if you swear to me, on whatever you hold sacred, that you will not call the village. Swear it." Geneva sat back on her heels. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to send word to the village head that a strange wolf woman had crawled to her door, to let wiser and more powerful people decide what was to be done. She had spent her whole life doing the safe thing where the village was concerned, smiling and nodding, and being small enough to be tolerated. She thought of the gold eyes in the snow. She thought of how the wolf had laid its great head against her knee instead of taking her throat. "I swear it," she said. "Not on God, because I'm not sure God spends much time at the edge of this forest. I swear it on my mother, who taught me that you don't get to choose who needs saving." Marlene closed her eyes, and a single tear slid into her moonlight hair. "Then I will tell you. I was branded a rogue 3 days ago, hunted from my own home, cast out with this." Her pale fingers found the broken chain at her throat. "There are wolves in these woods tonight, searching for me. If they find me here, they will not spare you for your kindness. You should know that. You should know what you have brought into your house." Outside, as if summoned by the words, a howl rose from the deep woods. Then another, from a different direction. Hunting calls, answering one another across the dark, searching. Geneva went to the small window and looked out at the storm. Far off between the trees, low to the ground, she thought she saw eyes, pairs of them, glinting, moving. She let the curtain fall and turned back to the fire. "They won't come here tonight," she said, with more certainty than she felt. "Not in this storm. And tomorrow we'll think of something. There may be no tomorrow for me, child." Marlene's hand pressed against the great curve of her belly, and her whole face tightened. "He is coming. Tonight. Now." Geneva's heart lurched. "You can't. You're too weak. You've lost too much. Tell that to my son." A spasm took her, and she arched against the floor, her teeth bared, the gold of her eyes flaring almost to white. "He does not care that the timing is poor. He has decided to be born into a kingdom that wants him dead. And there is nothing either of us can do but help him do it." So Geneva did the only thing she had ever truly known how to do. She gathered her linen and her warm water and her steady hands. She knelt between the knees of a queen she had met an hour before, and she prepared to bring a prince into the world alone, while wolves circled in the snow and the fire threw their two shadows, huge and trembling against the cottage wall, wound with a will that had nothing left in it but love. "Stay with me," Geneva murmured, again and again pressing cool cloths to the woman's brow, warming her cold hands between her own. "Stay with me, Marlene. He needs you here, just a little longer." "I am here," the queen breathed. "I am here. Tell me, healer. Tell me of something good. Anything. I cannot think only of the pain, or I shall let go of it, and I am not ready to let go." So Geneva talked. She told her about the spring, when the snow drew back from the forest floor, and the first green came up through the dead leaves, how the whole world smelled of waking earth, and how she would walk for hours gathering the new growth. She told her about the foxes that denned behind the cottage and the kits that tumbled in the dooryard in the warm months. She told her about her mother's hands and the songs her mother used to hum while she worked, and she found, to her own surprise, that her voice did not break, and that the telling steadied her own heart as much as the Queen's. And near the deepest hour of the night, when the storm had screamed itself hoarse against the shutters and the fire had burned down to a sullen red, the prince was born. He came in a rush at the last, small and slick and blue-white in the firelight, and for one endless moment he did not cry, and Geneva's heart stopped. She cleared his mouth with her finger. She rubbed his tiny back with the linen. She breathed her own warm breath against his cold little face, willing him, begging him, live, please, live. He drew in a breath that seemed too large for so small a chest, and then he cried. It was not the thin mewl of a weak newborn. It rose, clear and furious and astonishing, filling the little cottage, and at the sound of it something strange happened. The dying embers of the fire flared up bright gold without anyone touching them. A faint mark glowed for the space of a heartbeat on the infant's tiny shoulder. A crescent moon above a crown, the same crest that hung broken at his mother's throat, and then faded as though it had never been. Outside, the hunting howls fell silent all at once, as if every wolf in the forest had stopped to listen. Geneva, kneeling in the firelight with a crying prince in her hands, felt the hair rise on her arms. She did not understand what she had seen. She only knew that it was important, that it was old, that it was bigger than her cottage and her village, and perhaps the whole kingdom. She wrapped the baby in clean linen and laid him against his mother's breast. Marlene looked down at her son, and the grief and the terror went out of her face, and what was left was so purely, helplessly tender that Geneva had to look away. "Orund," the Queen whispered. "His name is Arund, the last child of the old blood." Her gold eyes lifted to Geneva, and they were brighter now, feverish. "Listen to me, for I do not have much time, and there is much you must know. He is not a rogue's whelp. He is royal. He is the son of the king who is dead, and the brother of the king who lives. There are those who will say he should never have been born, because while he draws breath their lie about me cannot stand. Do you understand?" "No," Geneva said honestly, "but I'm listening." With trembling fingers, Marlene lifted the broken chain over her own head and pressed it into Geneva's hand, folding the healer's cold fingers around the metal. "Then take this and keep it hidden, and trust no one in fine clothes. This chain is more than it seems. It carries the proof of what was done to me. When the time comes, and it will come, it will speak for the dead when the living are too afraid." Her grip tightened with sudden strength. "Swear to me a second time, Geneva. Swear that whatever happens to me, you will not let them take my son." Geneva looked down at the broken chain in her hand and the sleeping prince at the Queen's breast, and she understood that her quiet life was over, that it had ended the moment she turned off the path toward a howl in the dark, and that she would not have chosen differently, even knowing all of this. "I swear it," she said. And in that moment, before either of them could say another word, a fist hammered against the cottage door, and a rough voice called out into the storm, "Healer! Open up! We know you're in there. There's a rogue wolf been tracked to your door, and the whole village knows it. Open up, or we'll open it for you. Act the beast's blood right up to your step. You've sheltered a rogue, and that's a crime against the whole village. The thing dies tonight, before it brings the packs down on us." "There is no beast here," Geneva said. "There is a woman, and there is a newborn child not an hour old. If you want to come through this door, Holt, you'll come through it, knowing you raised a blade against an infant and the woman who just birthed him." The torchlight wavered. Some of the hunters glanced at one another, but Holt's jaw set hard. Rogues take woman's shape to trick the soft-hearted. You of all people should know that. Your own mother warned us against them. He raised the torch higher to see past her. Move. Last warning. Geneva did not move. Instead, she reached behind her without looking, to the iron poker she had left heating in the fire, and she drew it out glowing dull orange, and held it level between them. And her hand did not shake. I have nursed half this village through fever, she said, and her voice rang out steady over the wind. I sat with your own daughter, Holt, when the coughing sickness took her 3 winters past, and I did not leave her side for 4 days. You paid me with a sack of turnips, and you never said my name again in daylight. So do not stand at my door and tell me what I should know. I know exactly what I am protecting. Come and take it, if your conscience will let you. For a long moment nothing moved but the snow, and then the dogs began to scream, not bark. Scream, high and panicked, and bolt, dragging their handlers off their feet into the drifts. The hunters turned, torches swinging wildly, and the torchlight fell upon the tree line at the edge of the dooryard. And every man among them went still as stone. Wolves had come out of the forest. Not rogues, ragged and desperate, but a column of them, huge and dark and ordered, their eyes burning gold and green in the night, moving with the terrible discipline of soldiers. And at the head of them, just stepping from beneath the black trees into the torchlight, came a man. He was tall, taller than any of them, broad through the shoulders, his dark hair falling wild about a face that might have been carved for the purpose of commanding fear. A short dark beard, a jaw like the prow of a ship. He wore black armor chased with gold, and a heavy cloak of black fur clasped at his throat, and upon his brow sat a circle of worked gold that caught the torchlight and threw it back. His eyes, when they swept across the frozen dooryard, were the gold of his wolves, and they were terrible. The hunters fell to their knees in the snow. Even Holt, after a frozen breath, sank down, the torch trembling in his fist. My king, he stammered. Alpha King Robert, we were only. But the king was not looking at him. The king was looking at Geneva, standing alone in her doorway with a glowing poker in her hand and blood on her dress, between his soldiers and whatever lay behind her in the firelit dark. And his face, that face built for commanding fear, wore an expression that had nothing of fear in it and nothing of command. It was confusion. It was almost wonder. Stand aside, he said to her. His voice was low and rough, the voice of a man who did not often need to repeat himself. I have followed a trail of blood across 40 miles of forest. Whatever is in that house, it is mine to deal with. Stand aside, woman. No, said Geneva. The word dropped into the silence like a stone into a well. Somewhere a wolf growled. The king's brows drew down, and for an instant, the air around him seemed to thicken, to press. The raw weight of an alpha's will rolling out across the snow until the kneeling hunters pressed their faces to the ground, and even Geneva's knees ached to fold. She locked them. She lifted her chin. There is a dying woman and a newborn child behind me, and I have sworn to protect them both, and I will not move for you any more than I would move for them. She nodded at the men in the snow. You can knock me down. You're all stronger than I am. But you'll have to do it, and you'll have to know you did it, and I don't think a true king wants to start his hunt that way. Robert Curley, Alpha King of the North, feared by every pack from the frozen sea to the southern hills, stared at the small, blood-stained healer who would not bow, and something flickered behind his terrible gold eyes that he himself did not recognize. And then, from inside the cottage, a woman's voice rose, weak but unmistakable, and it spoke a single word that brought the king's whole world crashing down. Robert. He went white beneath the torchlight. The poker forgotten, Geneva stepped back. and the king crossed the threshold of the little cottage in 2 strides, and stopped and stood as though struck through the heart. Marlene lay by the dying fire, the newborn prince at her breast, her moonlight hair spread across Geneva's poor pillow, her gold eyes shining up at him. "My son," the queen breathed, "my beautiful, terrible son. I prayed it would be you who found me. I prayed, and I did not think I had the right to pray anymore." "Mother," the word broke out of the king, as though it tore something on the way. He fell to his knees beside her, this enormous armored man, suddenly young, suddenly lost. "They told me you were dead. They told me you turned rogue and fled and died in the wild like an animal. They showed me your chain, snapped, with blood on it. I mourned you. I burned candles for you for a year. I know what they told you." Marlene's hand rose to touch his bearded cheek, and her thumb wiped a tear he did not know he had shed. "And now you will hear what is true, and you will hear it quickly, for I have only this little time left, and I do not mean to waste it." Her gold eyes were fierce now, burning, a queen's eyes to the last. "I was not cast out by enemies beyond the kingdom, Robert. I was betrayed from within. The hand that branded me rogue, the hand that drove this sword into my side, it sits at your own council table. It refills your cup. It asks after your health. Who?" The king's voice dropped to something low and deadly, and around the cottage his wolves stirred and growled. "Give me the name, mother, and I will tear his heart out before the sun rises. If I name him now, with no proof, you will be the one who hangs for it, for he has spent years making himself beloved while he made me a monster." She drew a long, shuddering breath, and Geneva saw, with the sure knowledge of her trade, that it was very nearly the last. "The proof is hidden. The healer holds the key, though she does not yet know what it opens. Trust her, Robert. Trust her with your brother's life, for she has already kept it once when she had every reason to let it go." The gold eyes turned with the last of their light to Geneva. "His name is Orund. He is your brother. The throne is his birthright, and your love is his shield. Guard him." "I will," the king said. "I swear it, mother." But Marlene was already looking past him, past all of them, at something none of them could see, and the fierceness eased out of her face and left only peace. Her hand went slack against her son's cheek. The light went out of her gold eyes like a candle carried into another room. The Luna Queen Marlene Morales, falsely branded, hunted across 40 miles of winter, having birthed her last child in a stranger's poor cottage, and lived just long enough to give him a name and a deed. Guardian was gone. The newborn prince, as though he felt it, began to cry, and the Alpha King knelt in the firelight beside his dead mother, in a healer's cottage at the lonely edge of the world. And for one long moment, the most feared man in the north simply wept. They buried the Luna Queen at dawn beneath the old birches where the fever moss grew, because Geneva said it was the most peaceful place she knew, and the king did not argue. He dug the grave himself. He would let no soldier touch the spade. Geneva watched him work in the grey morning light, this king in his ruined finery, the snow settling on his dark hair, and she thought that grief made all men the same size in the end, whether they wore crowns or rags. When it was done, when the last of the frozen earth was patted into place, and the king had knelt one final time at the small mound, he rose and turned to Geneva, who held the newborn prince wrapped against the cold inside her own cloak. "You will come to the palace," he said. It was not a request, but neither was it quite a command. He seemed uncertain of how to speak to her, this man who was uncertain of nothing. "My brother is hours old, and his mother is dead, and there is no woman in my court I would trust to keep him alive through the winter. You kept him alive when you had every reason in the world to refuse. You will come, and you will care for him, and you will be paid as no healer in the kingdom has ever been paid." Geneva looked down at the small face inside her cloak, at the tiny fist that had escaped the linen and curled against her breast. She thought of her cottage, her quiet, her safe and forgotten life. She thought of Marlene's voice. "Guard him. I'll come," she said. "Not for the pay, for her and for him." Something in the king's hard face eased, just slightly, like a fist beginning to open. "Then we go." The palace of the Alpha Kings stood 3 days' ride to the south, where the forest gave way to high white walls and towers that pierced the winter sky like the teeth of some sleeping beast. Geneva had heard of it her whole life and never thought to see it. And when they came over the last rise and it lay spread below them, vast and gleaming and cruel and beautiful, she understood for the first time the true size of the thing she had agreed to. She did not belong here. She had known it before, in her head. Now she knew it in her bones. They rode through gates taller than her whole cottage, into courtyards where servants in fine livery stopped and stared, and the staring followed her like a cold draught down a corridor. A poor healer in a brown cloak, mud and worse on her hem, carrying the king's newborn brother against her chest, riding behind the Alpha King himself. By the time they reached the inner keep, Geneva could feel the whispers gathering behind her, like a wave about to break. She was given a chamber. That was the first shock. A chamber larger than her entire cottage, with a real glass window and a bed wide enough for 3 of her and a fire, already laid and lit. And beside it, through a connecting door, the royal nursery, where a cradle of dark carved wood waited for a prince who had been born on a stranger's floor. "You will sleep here," the king said, standing too large in the pretty doorway. Beside him, "There are servants to fetch whatever you require. Master Orwen, my royal healer, will bring you what you need for the child. If anyone troubles you—" He paused, and his gold eyes held hers a moment longer than was comfortable, and Geneva felt something pass between them that she had no name for, a strange tug behind her breastbone, there and gone. "If anyone troubles you, you will tell me. Only me, do you understand?" "I understand more than you think," Geneva said. "I understand that your mother was killed by someone in this house, and that you don't know who, and that the safest thing for that someone would be for the child she died to save, to quietly stop breathing in the night. I understand that you've brought me here as much to be a witness as a nurse. You don't have to dress it up. I'm not a child." The king stared at her. Then, for the first time since she had met him, the corner of his hard mouth moved, almost into something like a smile. "No," he said, "you are certainly not that." He turned to go, then stopped at the door without looking back. His mother was the only person in this palace who ever spoke to me without measuring her words first. I had forgotten what it sounded like. "Good night, healer." He was gone before she could answer. Geneva stood in the fire-lit nursery with the sleeping prince in her arms and her heart, beating strangely against the broken chain, still hidden in her bodice. And she told herself, sternly, that the warmth spreading through her chest was only the heat of the unfamiliar fire. She did not believe herself. She was, after all, an excellent liar to everyone except herself. Late that night, unable to sleep, she rose to check the prince and found the king already there. He had come without his crown, without his armor, in a plain dark tunic, and he stood over the cradle in the low light of the banked fire, looking down at his sleeping brother with an expression so raw and unguarded that Geneva froze in the doorway, feeling she had walked in on something private as nakedness. "He has her hands," the king said, not turning around. He had heard her, or smelled her, or simply known. "My mother's hands, long fingers. She used to." His voice caught, and he mastered it. "She used to braid my hair when I was small, before my father decided a future king had no business with a mother's softness." I had forgotten that too. I seemed to have spent years forgetting her, so that the missings would not be so heavy. And now she is truly gone, and all the forgetting was for nothing. Because here it all is. Geneva crossed the room and stood beside him at the cradle, near enough to feel the warmth of him. "Grief isn't a weight you carry," she said softly. "It's a debt you pay. You pay a little every day. Some days you can afford more than others. It never quite ends, but it does get." She searched for the word payable. Survivable. He looked down at her, this enormous fearsome king, in the firelight, with his dead mother fresh in the ground, and his orphaned brother sleeping between them. "You speak as one who has paid." "My mother died when I was 19, Geneva said. "I've been paying for 11 years. I'm 30 now. Some days it's only a coin. Some days it's everything I have." She reached into the cradle and tucked the linen more snugly around the prince, and her hand brushed the king's where it rested on the cradle's edge, and neither of them moved it away. The fire popped. Outside the wind walked the high, cold corridors of the palace. And between a poor healer and an Alpha King, in the small hours of the night, over the sleeping body of a child neither had given birth to, but both would die to protect, something began that neither of them was yet brave enough to name. The palace, Geneva soon learned, was not one place but two. There was the palace of stone and fire and food, the warm rooms and the soft beds, and that palace was kind to her in the way that wealth is kind to anyone it cannot help touching. And there was the other palace, the palace of glances and whispers and silences that fell when she entered a room, and that palace hated her with a patience and a thoroughness that the village had never managed. The village had only feared her. The court despised her. "They say she found him in a ditch," said one fine voice behind a fan, not quite quietly enough, as Geneva passed through the long gallery with the prince in her arms. "They say she shares the rogue's blood herself," said another. "Why else would a wolf go to her? Like calls to like. They say the king visits the nursery at night." A pause full of meaning. Do they? The two women at the center of this, Geneva quickly came to know by sight. Lady Marguerite Austin was tall and proud and wore her gowns like armor, with a face that had decided long ago to find everything beneath it. The widow Karen Magdalen was smaller, sharper, with eyes that missed nothing and a tongue that forgave nothing. And where Marguerite led the scorn, Karen sharpened it and handed it back. Geneva learned to walk past them with her chin level and her eyes ahead, the way she had learned to walk past the village folk who would not say her name in daylight. She had decades of practice at being looked through. It should not have hurt. It hurt anyway. She had hoped, foolishly, that a palace might be different, that somewhere there might be a door she could walk through and simply belong on the other side. There was no such door. There had never been. She had only changed the size and the splendor of the room she did not belong in. "Pay them no mind," said a dry voice at her elbow one afternoon, and Geneva turned to find an old man watching her with sharp grey eyes set in a face like weathered oak. He wore the long dark robe of a royal healer, and he carried a satchel that clinked softly with vials, and his hands, she noticed at once, were a healer's hands, stained and scarred and sure. Cruelty is the only craft most of them have ever practiced. They are quite good at it, in the way that a man who has done nothing else with his life is good at the one thing he does. It signifies nothing about you and everything about them. "Master Orwen," Geneva said. They had spoken briefly the first day, about herbs and feeding and the care of a newborn, and she had liked him at once, for he was the first person in the palace to treat her as a colleague rather than a curiosity. "I didn't take them for masters of anything." "Oh, they are. The court is a forest like any other, child, only the predators wear silk." He fell into step beside her, peering into the bundle at the sleeping prince. "How does our small prince fare?" You have a steady look about you that I find more reassuring than 100 court physicians. He feeds well. He sleeps poorly. He cries with his whole chest, as though he means to be heard in the next kingdom. Geneva hesitated, then decided she would rather have one true ally than 100 polite strangers. Master Orwen. When he was born, there was a mark on his shoulder, a crescent and a crown, glowing just for a moment and then gone, and the fire flared without anyone touching it. Do you know what that means? The old healer stopped walking. The sharp grey eyes went very still, and he glanced up and down the gallery before he answered. Lo, I know what the old books say it means, he said. And if it is true, child, then that infant in your arms is far more dangerous to certain people than even his mother was. Come to my workroom this evening, after the court has gone to dine. Bring the child. We will speak where the walls are thicker. He patted her arm with one scarred hand and moved off down the gallery, and Geneva watched him go, with her heart beating quick against the hidden chain. She did not get to the workroom that evening. Because that evening, the prince fell ill. It came on fast, the way fevers do in the very young. By dusk his small body burned in her arms, his cries gone thin and weak, his skin flushed and dry and far too hot. The palace physicians came and frowned and bled him with leeches and pronounced grave words, and Geneva, watching the life flicker in the tiny prince like a candle in a draught, did the thing that had cost her standing in the village 100 times, and would cost her standing here too, and did not care. She threw the physicians out. Out, she said, gathering the prince against her chest. All of you, out. Leeches on an infant with a dry fever. You'll kill him faster than the sickness will. She turned to the servant by the door. I need cool water, not cold, clean cloths. And go to Master Orwen and tell him I need willow bark and elderflower, finely ground, and a little honey, and I need it now, and tell him Geneva says the moon-marked child is burning. The night that followed was the longest of her life, longer even than the night of the birth. She stripped the prince and bathed him with cool cloths to draw the heat from his skin. She dripped the willow tea between his tiny lips, a drop at a time, patient as falling snow. She held him against her bare skin, so that her own steady warmth could steady his, and she walked the floor of the nursery from dusk until the window greyed with dawn, talking to him, singing to him the songs her own mother had hummed, refusing to let him go, and near dawn the fever broke. The prince sighed, and his skin grew damp and cool, and he opened his dark eyes and looked up at her, and, for the first time in his short life, did not cry. He simply looked, with the deep, solemn attention of the very young, as if he were memorizing the face of the woman who had pulled him back from the dark twice now. Geneva sat down on the floor of the nursery with the prince in her arms and wept with relief, and that was how the king found her when he flung the door open at first light. Having been told only that his brother was dying, he took in the scene in an instant. The cool cloths, the willow tea, the spent and weeping healer, the calm and breathing child. And the terror went out of him, and he crossed the room and dropped to his knees in front of her, careless of his dignity, his hands hovering over the two of them as though afraid to touch and break the fragile peace. He lives, the king said. He lives, Geneva agreed, her voice cracked from the long night of singing. He's strong, your brother. Stronger than the sickness. Stronger than them. She had not meant to say the last word, but it slipped out, and the king's gold eyes sharpened. Them? The physicians wanted to bleed him. With leeches, an infant with a dry fever. She shook her head wearily. I sent them away. I expect that's another mark against me in the great ledger of my crimes. The low-born healer, who knows better than the king's own doctors. The king was quiet for a moment. Then he rose, and he held down his hand to her, and after a moment's hesitation she took it, and he drew her to her feet as easily as if she weighed nothing, and he did not let go of her hand at once. "Tonight," he said, "before the whole court at the evening meal, I will thank you, by name, for saving the life of a prince of the blood." His thumb moved once slowly across the back of her hand, and Geneva felt that strange tug behind her breastbone again, stronger now. "Let them choke on it. That will only make them hate me more," she said, though her hand did not pull away. "Let them," the king said again, and his voice had gone low and rough in a way that had nothing to do with thanks. "I find I have stopped caring what they hate. I find I have started caring a great deal more about what one person in this palace thinks of me. And she is not on the council, and she does not own a single jewel, and she sent 3 of my physicians out of a sick room by the scruff of their necks." He released her hand, slowly as though it cost him something. "Rest, Geneva. I will watch him a while." He stayed. He sat by the cradle in the grey dawn light, the most feared king in the north, and watched his sleeping brother breathe, and Geneva lay down on the wide, soft bed in the next room and listened to him hum, very low and very awkward, a tune she recognized, one of the songs she had sung through the night, that he must have heard through the wall and was now trying clumsily to remember. She fell asleep smiling, with the broken chain warm against her heart, and did not notice that the smile was the first true one she had smiled in 11 years. The king kept his word. That night, before the whole assembled court, he rose at the high table and named Geneva, and thanked her, and the silence that followed was the loudest sound she had ever heard. It changed nothing, and it changed everything. The whispers did not stop, they only learned to be quieter. But now they had a shape, and the shape was fear, because the court had understood something that night that Geneva herself had not yet allowed herself to understand, that the Alpha King's eyes followed the poor healer around the room the way a starving man's eyes follow bread. The first person to turn that understanding into a weapon was Duke Randy Early. He was the handsomest man Geneva had ever seen, and the most polished, with pale gold hair swept back from a smooth, untroubled brow, and a smile that arrived exactly when a smile was wanted, and never an instant before. He wore deep blue, always, with silver rings on his long, pale fingers, and he moved through the cruel court like oil over waters, soothing, smoothing, beloved. Where Marguerite and Karen sneered, the Duke was kind. That, Geneva would only understand much later, was precisely what made him dangerous. "They are beasts, the lot of them," he said to her. First time he contrived to walk beside her in the gallery, his voice warm with sympathy. "I have watched them peck at you for a fortnight, and I confess it has shamed me to share their company. A woman who saves a prince's life ought to be honored, not whispered about behind fans. I wished you to know that not every soul in this palace is so small." "That's kind of you, Your Grace," Geneva said, and meant it, because she did not yet know better. "Kindness is the least I can offer." He smiled the smile. "I served the old king. I knew the Luna Queen Marlene well. A great lady, gravely wronged by whatever drove her to the wild. It has long grieved me that her name was so blackened. If ever you wish to understand the woman whose child you guard, I have access to the old palace records, letters, accounts of those final days. I would be glad to share them with you. The truth of her, healer, when no one else will give you the truth of anything." It was a generous offer, and it was made gently, and it tugged at exactly the thing Geneva most wanted, which was to understand the queen who had died on her floor. She very nearly thanked him on the spot. But Marlene's voice came to her, soft and certain across the weeks. Trust no one in fine clothes, and the Duke wore the finest clothes in the palace. "You're very generous," she said carefully. "I'll think on it." That evening she made the mistake of mentioning the Duke's kindness to the king, and watched his whole face change. "Randy Early," the king said flatly. He had come to the nursery, as he came every night now, and he stood by the dark window with his arms folded, and the warmth that had been growing between them all those quiet evenings closed up like a fist. "Stay away from him." "He was only kind to me," Geneva said, stung. "He's offered me the old records. Letters about your mother, the truth of what happened to her. Don't you want that?" "What I want," the king said, low and hard, "is for you to stay away from a man whose father plotted against mine, and whose smile has buried more honest men than the winter ever has. He offers you records. He offers everyone something. That is how he works. He learns the shape of the thing you want most, and then he becomes the only door to it." He turned from the window, and his gold eyes were fierce. "Promise me, Geneva." And there it was, the thing she had been waiting for her whole life, and dreading just as long. A powerful person telling her what she might want, where she might walk, whom she might trust. It did not matter that he might be right. It mattered that he had said it like an order. And orders were the language of every person who had ever decided they knew Geneva's heart better than she did. In the silence after the door closed, Geneva sat down beside the cradle and pressed her hands to her hot face, and did not understand why an argument should make her chest hurt so. Why the absence of him should leave the room so much colder than the fire could account for. Why she wanted, absurdly, to run after him into the cold corridor and take it all back. She told herself it was loneliness. She had been lonely so long that any warmth felt like more than it was. She told herself the king was a king, and she was a healer who would return to her cottage when the prince was grown enough to need a nurse instead, and that whatever this strange tugging ache was, it could lead nowhere but to her own greater loneliness when she left. And in his own chambers, far across the cold palace, the Alpha King Robert Curley stood before his fire with his fists clenched and his jaw tight, fighting a knowledge that had been growing in him since the night he crossed a healer's threshold and found her standing between his soldiers and his dying mother. He had felt it the first time her hand brushed his at the cradle. He had felt it stronger every night since. The pull, the bond, the thing his kind called fate, the recognition of a mate, sunk into his blood and his bone and unwilling to be reasoned away. She was his. Some deep wolf-certain part of him had known it from the first, and he would say nothing. He would not say one word of it, because she was a woman who had spent her whole life being told what she was, and where she belonged, and whom she might love, and he would be damned before he became one more voice telling Geneva her own heart. If she came to him, she would come freely, or she would not come at all. He would carry the knowledge alone and let it burn him and wait. He did not know how little time the waiting had left, for across the palace, in a chamber hung with deep blue, Duke Randy Early stood at his own window and smiled his perfect smile at the dark, and turned a silver ring slowly round his finger, and thought about a glowing mark on an infant's shoulder and a broken chain that had never been found among the dead queen's things, and a low-born healer who had become, without quite knowing it, the most important obstacle between himself and a throne. Soon, he said softly to no one. Very soon now. Geneva took the broken chain to Master Orwen. Because she had run out of people, she could carry it to alone. She had kept it hidden against her heart for a month, and the keeping of it had become a kind of slow poison, the weight of Marlene's last words pressing on her every hour. The proof is hidden. The healer holds the key. She did not know what it opened. She only knew she could not bear to hold it by herself one day longer. She found the old healer alone in his workroom late at night, surrounded by his books and his vials, and the warm clutter of a long life spent mending things. She barred the door. She drew the chain from her bodice and laid it on the worn table. Between them in the candlelight, the snapped links, the crescent and crown pendant, and watched the old man's sharp grey eyes go wide. "The Queen's chain," he whispered. "They said it was lost. They said it was buried with the blood still on it." He looked up at her, and there was a new wariness in his face, and a new respect. "She gave this to you, with her last breath but one. She said it carries the proof of what was done to her. She said the healer holds the key, but she died before she could tell me what it opens." Geneva spread her hands. "I've turned it over 1,000 times. It's a chain. It's a broken chain. I don't see any proof in it. I don't see anything but a mother's grief." Master Orwen took up the pendant in his scarred fingers and held it close to the candle, turning it this way and that, and his frown deepened, and then slowly his breath caught. "This is no ordinary seal," he said. "Look, the crescent and the crown, but here at the join, where it ought to be, solid." He pressed something with his thumbnail, and there was a faint click, and the flat pendant opened on a hinge so fine Geneva had never seen it, revealing a hollow within, and inside the hollow, folded smaller than a fingernail, a scrap of parchment. They unfolded it together, scarcely breathing, in the candlelight. It was a list of names, and at the bottom, beneath the names, in a hand grown shaky with fear or with haste, a single line: "They mean to take the throne through the child that is to come. R.E. has bought the Eastern Guard. Trust the moon mark. M." Geneva read it 3 times before the letters made sense, and when they did, her blood ran cold. "R.E., she whispered. "Randy Early," said Master Orwen grimly. "Duke of the Eastern Marches, the most beloved man in the palace." He set the parchment down with the care of a man handling a live coal. She knew. Before they came for her, she knew, and she could not name him openly, because no one would believe a queen over a duke they adored, and so she hid it where only a healer would think to look, in the hollow of a moon seal. And she trusted it would find its way to honest hands. He looked up. "Your hands, child?" Before Geneva could answer, a soft knock came at the barred door. They froze. Geneva swept the chain and parchment into her bodice in a single motion. Orwen called out, his voice steady, "Who comes?" "It is Donna, Master," came a woman's voice, low and quick. "Donna Cohen, please. I must speak with the healer, and it must be now, and it must be quiet." Orwen and Geneva exchanged a glance. Then he unbarred the door, and a young palace attendant slipped through it. A plain-faced, quiet woman Geneva had seen 12 times carrying linens and water, and never once heard speak above a murmur. Donna's hands were twisting in her apron, and her eyes were wide and frightened. "Forgive me," she said. "I have wanted to speak for weeks and feared to. But the prince's fever, and the way you fought for him, I have decided I would rather be brave, once than ashamed forever." She drew a breath. "On the night the Luna Queen vanished, the night before the great storm, I could not sleep, and I went to the kitchens, and from the window I saw her, the Queen, dragged through the eastern gate by men of the guard, bound and gagged, and the Duke Randy Early walking ahead of them with a lantern. I told myself I had dreamed it. I have told myself that every night since, but I did not dream it. They took her out the eastern gate alive, and the next morning the court was told she had turned rogue and fled in the night. The room was very quiet, the candle guttered. The Eastern Guard, Geneva said softly, thinking of the parchment. He bought the Eastern Guard. There is more, Donna whispered. There was a guardsman, Mark Tate, a young man, honest, my friend. He saw what I saw, and he was not so careful as I, he asked. Questions. 3 days ago he was sent away on some errand to the southern garrison, and no word has come of him since, and the man who gave him the order, was the Duke's own steward. Her voice broke. I think they have killed him for asking. I think they will kill anyone who asks. And I am so afraid, but I could not let you guard that child in the dark any longer, not knowing what you guard him against. Geneva crossed the small room and took the frightened woman's twisting hands in her own and held them still. You were brave tonight, she said, braver than the whole court in their silk. Thank you, Donna. Whatever comes, you will not stand in it alone. I swear it. And as she said the words, Geneva understood fully and finally the trap she stood in the middle of. Marlene had not been hunted from outside the kingdom by faceless enemies. She had been betrayed from within, dragged from her own home, through her own gate, by men paid with the Duke's gold, and branded a monster so that no one would mourn her, so that no one would ask why she had to die, so that no one would protect the child she carried, the child who, by simply being born legitimate and alive and moon-marked, gave the lie to everything Randy Early had built. The child sleeping, right now, in a cradle 3 corridors away, guarded by no one but a quiet attendant Geneva did not yet fully trust, and the long winter night. Master Orwin, Geneva said, already moving toward the door, her heart climbing into her throat. The Duke has been patient for a month. He's been kind. He's been waiting. Waiting for what? The old healer's face went grey as he understood. For an occasion, he said, for a moment when the whole court is gathered, and the prince is exposed, and the king's guard is thinned. For a ceremony, and from somewhere far below in the great palace, as if the very stones meant to answer him, a deep bell began to toll, slow and solemn, calling the court to gather. The blood moon, Orwin breathed. It is tonight. The ceremony to recognize the prince is tonight. He has chosen tonight. The great throne hall blazed with 1,000 candles, and above the high windows hung the blood moon, swollen and red, staining the snow on the sills the color of old wounds. Geneva stood near the dais with the prince in her arms, dressed in the fine dark gown the king had insisted she wear, and she had never in her life felt so much like a deer in an open field. The whole court had gathered, the nobles in their jewels, the councils in their robes. The guard ranged along the walls in gleaming mail. At the center of it all, on the high black throne, sat the Alpha King Robert Curley in his crown and his armor, and beside the throne stood the empty cradle of carved wood, draped now in royal black, waiting to receive a prince before the eyes of the kingdom. And below the dais, gracious and golden and smiling, stood Duke Randy Early. Geneva had not been able to reach the king. She had tried. She had pushed through the gathering crowd with the prince in her arms, desperate to whisper what she knew, but the Duke's men had been everywhere, a polite wall of bodies, steering her always toward the dais and away from the throne, and the ceremony had begun before she could break through. Now she stood exposed before the whole court, with the truth burning in her bodice, and no way to speak it. The king rose. He lifted the ceremonial cup, the great chaste goblet of the old kings, brimming with dark wine, and his deep voice filled the hall. On this blood moon, he said, before the assembled court and council, I claim this child as my brother and a prince of the royal blood, Orond, son of King Aldous and Queen Marlene, last of the old line, under my protection and the protection of this throne. He raised the cup higher. Let any who would deny him speak now, or hold their peace forever. He drank. He drank deep, as the ancient rite required, and Geneva, watching the Duke's perfect face, saw the smile change, saw it sharpen, saw the satisfaction flare behind his pale eyes as the king lowered the cup. She understood an instant too late. The cup, she cried out, her voice ringing across the hall. My king, the cup is poisoned, don't. But it was already done. The king swayed. The great goblet slipped from his fingers and rang against the stone, dark wine spreading across the floor like spilled blood, and the Alpha King of the North, the most feared man in the kingdom, sank to one knee upon his own dais, his face going grey, his gold eyes dimming, his terrible strength draining out of him before the eyes of his entire court. The hall erupted into chaos, and into the chaos Duke Randy Early raised his beautiful voice, and it was no longer warm, and it was no longer kind. "Seize her!" he cried, pointing one ringed finger at Geneva. "There stands your poisoner, the rogue's healer, the low-born witch who crept into this palace with a rogue's bastard in her arms and bewitched your king. Look at him. She has used her foul rogue magic to strike down the Alpha King in his own hall. I warned the council she was dangerous. I begged them to act. Seize her and seize the cursed child before they murder us all." It was masterful. Geneva saw it land, saw the frightened court turn to her, saw the fear and the readiness to believe, because they had always wanted to believe the worst of her, because she was poor and strange and did not belong, and it was so much easier to believe a beloved duke than a healer found in a ditch, the Eastern Guardsman. She saw to it now, saw them move with purpose, while the loyal men hesitated in confusion, began to close the great doors of the hall, sealing them all inside. Other men in Eastern colors began to move, not toward Geneva, but past her, toward the empty black-draped cradle, toward the dais, toward the fallen king. And the prince in her arms, as though he felt the malice closing in, threw back his small head and began to scream. Geneva's mind, which had spent 30 years learning to be calm in the worst of moments, went very still and very clear. The king was poisoned, not dead. She could see his chest still rising, could see him fighting, one hand braced against the throne, refusing to fall further. The court was turned against her. The doors were closed. The duke's men were coming for the child wine. She looked at the king's greyed face. She thought of the willow and the elder, of the long night she had fought the prince's fever, of every poison and every cure her mother had ever drilled into her by the cottage fire, dark wine, the particular grey of his skin, the slowness, the cold, the way his great alpha strength had been the first thing to fail. Not his heart, not his breath, but his power. Wolfsbane, she thought. Winter wolfsbane, the rare blue-flowered kind that grew only in the high northern snows, the herb that did not kill a wolf, but stripped him of his strength, his shift, his alpha will. The herb she had handled 100 times, the herb whose antidote she knew the way she knew her own name. Duke Randy Early had made one mistake. He had chosen a poison meant to humiliate a king before it killed him, a poison of the deep north, and he had used it in front of the one person in the kingdom who had grown up gathering its cure. Geneva did not run. She turned to the frightened attendant at her side. Donna Cohen, who had pushed through to her, even now, even with the whole court turning, and she pressed the screaming prince into the woman's arms. "Guard him with your life," Geneva said. "Get him behind the throne, behind the king, and let no one in Eastern colors lay a hand on him. Can you do that?" Donna's face was white, but she nodded, and she took the prince and turned, fierce as any soldier, and ran for the dais. And Geneva, low-born healer, the woman they had all looked through, picked up her fine, dark skirts and ran toward the fallen king, toward the spreading poison, toward the heart of the trap, with the answer to all of it burning against her chest, and the whole court screaming for her blood. A guardsman in Eastern colors stepped into Geneva's path with his blade drawn, and she did not slow. "Master Orwin," she shouted over the roar of the hall. "The blue, the wolfsbane antidote. I need it now." And from the edge of the crowd, the old healer's voice answered. And his satchel came skidding across the stone floor between the guardsman's boots, and Geneva dropped to her knees and seized it, and was up again, before the man could decide whether to strike a kneeling woman before the whole court. She reached the dais. She fell to her knees beside the king. He was failing. His skin had gone the grey of ash, his lips blue at the edges, his gold eyes clouded. And the great body that had carried a wolf's strength, all his life now trembled with the effort of merely staying upright. But when he saw her face above him, something cleared in those dimming eyes. "Geneva," he breathed, "run. The doors. Be quiet and drink," she said, and her hands were already moving, fast and sure. The hands her mother had trained, tearing open the satchel, finding by touch alone the small stoppered vial of blue tincture, the crushed root, the things she had ground 100 times in a cottage at the edge of the world, never dreaming they would one day be used to save a king before his throne. Winter Wolfsbane, the Duke chose it to shame you before he buried you. He chose wrong. He chose the one poison in all the world I was raised to undo. She tilted the king's head back against her arm and pressed the vial to his blue lips. "Drink, Robert. Trust me. You told your mother you'd trust me. Drink." He drank. For a terrible moment nothing happened, and the Duke's voice rose in triumph behind her. "You see? You see her witchery. She finishes him with her own hand." And the hall surged, and Donna crouched behind the throne with the screaming prince, and the Eastern Guard pressed in. And then the Alpha King drew a breath that filled his whole great chest, and the grey began to recede from his skin like a tide going out, and the gold came back into his eyes, blazing now, blazing brighter than the 1,000 candles, and the raw weight of an Alpha's will rolled out across the throne hall in a wave that drove every wolf in the room to their knees. Robert Curley rose. He rose from the dais like a thing rising from the dead, vast and terrible and burning with rage, and the Eastern Guardsmen who had been creeping toward the cradle froze where they stood, and the triumph died on Duke Randy Early's perfect face. "Impossible," the Duke whispered. "You poisoned your king," Geneva said, rising beside Robert, and now she turned to face the whole staring court, and her voice rang out clear and unafraid, the voice of a woman who had stopped, at last, being small. Winter Wolfsbane in the ceremonial cup, a coward's poison, meant to strip an Alpha of his strength so that he might be murdered without a fight, before his own people, on the night he claimed his brother. You all watched it. You all believed his lie because it was easier than believing me. So now believe this. She reached into her bodice and drew out the broken chain, the crescent and the crown, and held it up so the candlelight ran along the snapped links, and a gasp went through the hall. "The Luna Queen Marlene's own chain," Geneva cried, "given to me by her own hand as she died in my cottage, branded a rogue, hunted across 40 miles of winter with a sword wound in her side. She was not cast out by enemies beyond the kingdom. She was dragged from this palace through the eastern gate, bound and gagged, alive, by men paid with the Duke's own gold. And there is a witness in this hall who saw it with her own eyes. She pressed the hidden catch as Orwen had shown her, and the pendant sprang open, and she drew out the folded scrap of parchment, and she left this in her own hand, her own last warning, hidden where only a healer would think to look. She read it aloud, ringing to the silent court. They mean to take the throne through the child that is to come. R.E. has bought the Eastern Guard. Trust the moonmark, signed with her own initial, R.E. Randy Early, Duke of the Eastern Marches. There stands your poisoner, there stands the rogue. The hall was utterly silent now. Every eye had turned from Geneva to the Duke, and his beautiful face had at last forgotten how to smile. "Lies," he said, but his voice had cracked. "Forgeries, a peasant's tricks." The great doors of the hall boomed open. Through them, half carried by 2 loyal guardsmen, came a young man in torn and bloodied colors, grey-faced, one arm hanging useless but alive, and his voice, when he raised it, carried across the frozen silence. "Mark Tate," he gasped, "of the palace guard. The Duke's steward had me waylaid on the southern road and left for dead in a ditch for asking how the Luna Queen left through a gate that was barred from the inside. I crawled 3 days to bring you the truth. The Eastern Guard answers to him. The plot is his. He told me so himself while he watched his men cut me. He was so certain I would die." The wounded man's eyes found the Duke, and they burned. "You should have made certain, Your Grace." Donna Cohen stood up from behind the throne, the prince quiet now in her arms, and stepped forward into the candlelight. "I saw the Queen dragged through the Eastern Gate alive," she said, her quiet voice steady at last. "I have carried it a month in shame. I carry it no longer. It was him." And then Master Orwin came forward with the old palace records in his hands, the very records the Duke had once dangled before Geneva, and laid them open before the council, and the names on Marlene's hidden list matched the names of the men the Duke had quietly raised to the Eastern Guard, one by one, in the year before the Queen was taken. The court turned. Geneva felt it turn, felt the great slow weight of it swing away from the Duke and toward the truth, the way a tide turns, and Marguerite Austin and Karen Maudlin, who had whispered the loudest, now stepped back from the Duke as though he had caught fire, their painted faces pale with the dawning horror of having been on the wrong side of it all. The Alpha King descended from his dais, his strength fully returned, his gold eyes fixed on the Duke, and the whole hall held its breath, certain it was about to watch a man torn apart. Duke Randy Early drew a hidden blade and lunged, not at the king, but at Geneva, the witness, the healer, the one who had undone him. Robert caught his wrist in the air. For one heartbeat, the two men strained against each other, the king and the traitor, and then the bones of the Duke's wrist gave way with a sound that everyone in the silent hall heard, and the blade rang upon the stone, and Randy Early went to his knees with a cry, and it was over. The king stood over him, breathing hard, his fist raised, his face a mask of grief and rage, his mother's death and his brother's danger and his own near murder, all burning in his eyes, and every soul in the hall waited for the blow that would end the Duke's beautiful, treacherous life. It did not come. The king lowered his fist. "No," Robert said, and his voice shook with the cost of it. "You would like that, would you not? A king who kills in his hall, in his rage, before his court. A king no better than the murderer at his feet. My mother did not die so that I could become you." He turned to his loyal guard. "Take him. Take all who wore his colors and raised a hand tonight. He will not die by my temper in the dark. He will answer before the whole kingdom, in the light, for what he did to the Luna Queen and what he tried to do to her son. Let every soul in the north see exactly what justice looks like when it is not afraid." And as they dragged the broken Duke away, the Alpha King turned in the center of his recovered hall and looked for the only person in it he wished to see, and found her standing by the throne, with his mother's broken chain in her hand and tears on her face, and the firelight in her hair, and the whole impossible weight of his hidden heart rose up in him at last, and would no longer be silent. In the days that followed, the kingdom learned what justice looked like when it was not afraid. Duke Randy Early was brought before the whole court, and the assembled lords of the North, and the evidence was laid out plain. Marlene's hidden parchment, the matched names of the bought guard, the testimony of Donna Cohen, and the wounded Mark Tate, the records Master Orwin had kept. There was no torture and no haste. There was only the slow, terrible weight of the truth, and against it the Duke's beauty and his polish and his perfect smile counted for nothing at all. He was stripped of his title and his lands and his name, and imprisoned in the deepest tower to live out his days knowing that the throne he had murdered a queen to reach had passed him by entirely. The men who had worn his colors and raised their blades faced their own judgment, each according to what he had done. Lady Marguerite Austin and the widow Karen Maudlin, who had whispered Geneva into a witch and a rogue, were summoned before the court and made to answer for the lies they had spread. And though they had drawn no blade, the king required of them a public accounting, that all might know cruelty too has its price, and the two proud women left the hall smaller than they had entered it, and never again found their whispers welcome. Donna Cohen, the quiet attendant who had chosen at last to be brave, was raised to the household of the prince himself, and given a place of honor and trust she had never dreamed of. And the guardsman Mark Tate, who had crawled 3 days through the snow on a shattered arm to bring the truth home, was healed by Geneva's own hands and named to the king's personal guard, and wore the honor of it for the rest of his life. The infant Prince Orand was recognized before the whole kingdom as the true and legitimate son of the old king, last of the ancient blood, and when the herald spoke his name, the moon mark glowed once more upon his small shoulder. The crescent and the crown, and the oldest lords in the hall went to their knees. For they knew the sign from the songs of their grandfathers, and they knew that the lie against his mother was undone forever. And Geneva, who had walked into the palace a month before in a mud-stained cloak, found herself, somehow, at the center of a kingdom's gratitude, and did not know what to do with it, for she had never been thanked by more than one frightened family at a time. And now a whole court bowed when she passed. It was the king who found her, on the 3rd night, standing alone at a high window, watching the snow fall over the palace, the broken chain in her hands. "You are leaving," he said. It was not a question. He had learned from his mother, and now from her, that the truest things were said plainly. The prince is recognized. He's safe. He has a household, a guard, a kingdom. Geneva did not turn from the window. I came to keep a promise to a dying queen. The promise is kept. I'm a healer, Robert. I belong in a cottage at the edge of a forest, mending fevers and birthing other women's children. I don't belong in a palace, and we both know it, no matter how kind the court has decided to be now that I'm useful. I've spent my whole life being useful. I know what comes after. The thanks fade, and the door closes, and I'm outside it again. Better to walk out myself than wait to be put out. For a long moment the king said nothing. Then he came to stand beside her at the window. Close, the warmth of him against her side in the cold air, and when he spoke his rough voice was very quiet. I have to tell you something I should have told you a long time ago. I have been a coward about it, which is a thing no one has ever called me before, and I find I do not enjoy it. He drew a breath. From the moment I crossed your cottage threshold and found you standing between my soldiers and my dying mother, I knew what you were to me. My kind has a name for it, the bond. The mate. The one the blood chooses and will not unchoose. I felt it the first time your hand brushed mine over Orand's cradle. I have felt it every night since, growing until I could think of little else. He turned to face her. I said nothing. Do you understand why I said nothing? Geneva had gone very still. Tell me, because you are a woman who has been told your whole life what you are and where you belong, and whom you may love by people who never once asked what you wanted. His gold eyes held hers. Your village, your court, even me, when I told you to fear the Duke as though you could not see a snake without my pointing. I would not be one more voice telling Geneva her own heart. I would not trap you with fate. If you came to me, you would come, because you chose me, freely, knowing you could walk out that door this very night, and I would let you go, and grieve, and let you go anyway. That is why I said nothing. I was waiting for your heart to be yours to give. It was the only gift I had that was worth giving you." Geneva looked at this enormous, fearsome king who could command armies and break a traitor's wrist with one hand, standing before her in the falling snow's light, with his whole heart open and undefended. Asking nothing, waiting, letting her choose. And she understood, finally, the thing she had been too frightened to understand for a month of quiet nights by a cradle. He had not brought her here because he needed a healer. He had not kept her because she was useful. The thanks would not fade, and the door would not close, because for the first time in her whole life she stood before someone who wanted her not for what her hands could do, but for the stubborn, tender, unbreakable heart that had turned off a forest path toward a howl in the dark, when every sensible voice told her to walk on. She had spent her life believing love came with a price, that people stayed only as long as they needed her, and here was a man telling her she could leave, that he would let her, that he loved her too well to hold her. And in the telling, he had given her the only proof she would ever need, that he would never let her go hungry for a place to belong again. "You maddening man," Geneva said, and her voice broke on a laugh that was half a sob. "You stood there all those nights humming my mother's songs through the wall, and you said nothing." "I am saying it now," Robert said. "Stay, not as a healer, not as a nurse, not because fate dragged you here. Stay because you choose to. Be my Luna. Be my equal. I have armies that fear me, and a court that bows to me, and not one single soul who ever told me the truth until you sent my physicians out of a sick room by their collars. Stay, Geneva. Choose me. I am asking, not commanding. I will never command you again as long as I live." Geneva looked down at the broken chain in her hands, the crescent and the crown, Marlene's last gift. Then she looked up at the king, and she made, freely, fully, with her whole unafraid heart, the only choice she had ever truly wanted to make. "I choose you," she said. He crowned her 3 days later, before the whole assembled kingdom, in the great hall beneath the high windows where the snow still fell. But that was the ceremony. The true moment had come the night before, alone, when he had taken her face in his great careful hands, as though she were something precious enough to break, and bent his head to hers, slow, giving her every chance to turn away, and she had not turned away. She had risen to meet him, her hands fisting in the front of his tunic, and the kiss when it finally came was a month of longing breaking its banks at once, deep and aching and hungry and tender all together, and she had felt the strength in him gentled to softness against her, the most feared man in the north, trembling beneath the touch of a healer's hands, and she had understood that some hungers are holy, and that this one had been waiting, patient as snow, since the first night she stood between him and the dark. When he crowned her the next day, the court did not bow because they were told to. They bowed because they had watched a low-born healer stand alone between armed men and a dying queen, stand alone against a poisoned cup and a court's scorn, stand alone with nothing but her mother's knowledge and her own stubborn heart, and save a king and a prince and a kingdom. She had not been born royal. She had become royal in the only way that ever truly mattered, through sacrifice and truth and a love freely given and freely returned. Geneva, the forgotten girl from the cottage at the edge of the world, knelt before her king and rose as Luna Queen of the North, and in her arms the small Prince Orand reached up one tiny hand and closed it, solemn and sure, around her finger, as though to say that she had always belonged. And so Geneva, the healer, who had once knelt in the snow beside a dying rogue wolf, rose before the kingdom as Luna Queen. Not because she chased a crown, not because she was born to a throne, but because when fear told everyone else to turn away, she chose mercy. Prince Orand lived. Marlene's name was cleared. Duke Randy Early and every hand that aided his betrayal faced judgment before the same court they had tried to deceive. And Alpha King Robert Curley, feared by every pack in the north, finally found the one woman who had never bowed to his power, but had answered his heart. Dear viewers, if Geneva's journey touched you, if you believe that kindness can change a kingdom, and that love is strongest when it is freely chosen, please subscribe, leave a like, and tell us where you are watching from. Your support helps bring more stories of forbidden love, royal secrets, wounded heroines, dangerous alphas, and unforgettable endings to this channel. Thank you for watching until the end. In our next tale, another forgotten woman will stand before a powerful alpha, and one secret will change the fate of an entire pack. Until then, may your heart remain brave, your kindness remain costly, and your story never end in the snow.